Shrinjita, it's actually well before the late 19th century that proscenium theatre comes into Bengal, and it does so with a vengeance. And a lot of people have written about it as to whether the fact that the performance is taking place on the stage, on the proscenium stage, with curtains, with the particular frame that a proscenium entails, and the lights, the movement, the very movement of people become different, obviously, if you're on stage. The distance, the elevation, all of that has been much, well, if not much, but debated quite seriously. And there's the question is perhaps not so much that did it come in and was it completely embraced, but what were the shifts and calibrations within this process? So people may have taken, say, the idea of a stage, but the context, where was it being performed? In somebody's home, the comprador gentry's home. Secondly, did what constituted abhinaya, which would, or sangeet, which would go across a spectrum of performance practices. So not just singing, dancing, acting in absolute discrete isolation. So that question is very rarely raised. That is to say, what happens to this composite because of the entry of not just the proscenium theatre, but of a vast number of touring performers. So the third point that I'd like to add is when people study, let's say, colonial theatre in India and the British, they don't very often take into account the huge spectrum of people who were sometimes variety performers. So somebody would be doing something with a little bit of popular dance and music. Someone might be doing a minstrel's show. Somebody might be doing actual acrobatics. All of that was entering the metropolis, but also smaller places, because by post the 1857 uprising, there's the cantonments come up. I've discussed this in one of my pieces, and the railways come up in a big way. So it means that there are people actually traveling from one small place to another and doing these acts. And also the soldiers' theatres come up, regimental theatres. So there's a huge circuit of traveling players. I'm calling them players, not just actors and actresses. By the way, there's one more thing, opera. Opera comes in a big way, and I don't think, again, it's been investigated.
Prior to Binodini, could you please give an overview of the Indian actresses who performed in the Bengali theatrical scene, and what sets Binodini apart from these actresses?
Well, Binodini comes in at a very early stage of the public theatre. So, although she's not one of the first 4-5 actresses, she's very much a first generation actress. So, as to whether, who were the other people before her and how she's different, instead of that, if I could sort of extend the scope a bit of your question and add to it another element, which is what are the new kinds of performance pieces that are coming up at this moment, say 1870s to 1880s. Can I do that?
Yes.
Yeah. Then there's several strands that we can identify. One is that, and again this has been much commented on, that why did the impetus to have very uh, socially radical plays, sometimes written by pundits, if you please, uh, commissioned very often by upper class gentry. Why, and part of reformist movements, as well as plays which are more explicitly political, because very often people don't see the women's question as sort of explicitly political, but others who were writing on questions of, already raising questions about oppression, colonial oppression. And of course, of this, the one that has been most discussed with, therefore I shall not discuss it now, is Neil Dorpon. But there were others. And there's what people notice quite correctly is that they seem to be phased out by pretty much by the end of the 1870s. And the usual response to that is the Dramatic Performances Act that muzzles this. That's undeniable that it does muzzle this. And there's enough of that already available, so I'm not going to get into that. But and then the other sort of explanation offered is that this new public, because you have to remember it's both the old public and the new public. That is to say, the same people who are coming to the public theatre might actually be going to Jatra performance, might actually be standing on the street and listening to some other, say, a woman kirtaniya singing. So it's not as if it's hermetically separate, but it's definitely also a new public in that as to what their expectations are from a ticketed, that's the big thing, so it's not just the proscenium, it's the fact that it's ticketed. And so at one level it's a kind of opening up, which is why the word in Bangla is very often Shorbo Shadharon, that it's for the, anyway, so even called Shadharon Rangala. So Shadharon here doesn't simply mean normal or simple, but that it's democratic at one level. But of course the usual problem that what do you do with mass when the moment of a popular taste comes on the scene. And you'll also have to remember that this is a time when there's massive discussions, meetings, protests, writings in print on what should be the norm of taste. So what is refined, what is obscene, what is moral, what is immoral. So it gets conflated, this moment, the 1860s, 70s and 80s, in a very deep morass, or if you like, a very fertile, to look at it in a more positive way, a fertile ground for raising questions of, well, what should people see? What should people listen to? And the whole question of entertainment as well. So amod in Bangla becomes a very important word. It circulates at this point. So to go back to your question, I would say that simply to look at the actress as, this one was better than that one, won't make sense. That's obviously true, that why did she stand out? But I'm saying you also have to look at the field in which she's performing, and that field is an extremely volatile one. So her range of roles, and off the top of my head I cannot tell you, but I can bring down the book and look it up and tell you, a range of roles in the very short span that she acted in, because as you know she left very early when she was at the peak of her fame. The range is incredible. So she's playing a servant maid, she's playing Chaitanya, a saint, she's playing Radha, she's playing a Sakhi, she's playing all of Bankim Chandra's heroines. and the romantic novel, the romantic hyphen historical novel is itself a new thing that's come up. So somewhere else I've called it the novel Naika. So this is the Naika who emerges straight from the novel. But she's also novel, she's new, in the sense she's a move away from Radha and Krishna. But the interesting thing is, so Binodini is playing all these roles. She's also cross-dressing. She's acting in fairly radical plays, Sarojini and all of that. But she gets iconized only in some roles. So people do say that, oh, she did. So it becomes like a list. So what I think is important in addressing the question that you are, is not just to look at the performance list, but what does the list mean for those times? And that's what I was trying to suggest, that it's both an exceptionally fertile period, but it's also, as historians have noted, that why does it then primarily end with bhakti ras, with neo Vaishnavism, with a kind of let us surrender to faith. Faith is all. And what did this faith mean? So I'll stop here again.
So, ma'am, since we were speaking about Vaishnavism, the bhakti, the Vaishnava rasa, so Vaishnavism became it became one of the most dominant religious and cultural current in 19th century Bengal. Theatre, as we know, absorbed. Theatre, as we know, got heavily influenced by the Vaishnava cult. How could one observe the cultural production that took place as a result of the cross between theatre and Vaishnavism?
Okay, I've written about this in detail, and it's called Benediction in Performance. And so I'll try and discuss the things that are not written about there. One of them, to give you just one example, first of all, it's Vaishnavism with a difference. Just as we say it's Hinduism with a difference. And the term Hindu itself is consolidated in the 19th century. Again, there's a huge amount of scholarship on this, so I needn't elaborate. So, but the particular and this goes back to your earlier question. By the 1880s, when you get these spate of plays, and you can fill in those details when you, there's been a resurgence of this questioning of what would constitute Indianness, although it's not that particular word, Indianness, Bharatiyata is not being used, but Deshya. The word that is used is Deshya. So what is indigenous? What is, to use a colonial term, what is native? What is Deshya? What is authentic? So it kind of gets this seal of what is not colonial? How do we recover that self? And one caveat, that it's not just happening in Bengal. For example, it's happening in Banaras, for example. And dramatists like Bhartendu Harishchandra is also engaging in it. But this resurgence, so this resurgence clearly at one level it is a resurgence because already different forms of Vaishnavism in everyday practice. So this is what I want to emphasize. So it's not only someone who professes to be a Vaishnava, but like in Bangla you say Tilokdhari Vaishnava, that is wearing the thing. But someone who is exposed to the entire gamut of Vaishnav expressive forms. And in Bangla this would be the Kirtan. The range of Kirtans, their move towards classicization, and their link with other, because this is a tradition which is based on bhava. So apart from all the plays that were written and performed, there's this huge almost, I would say, sea of music that would be absolutely typical of the Bengali region, which, of people. So they would be exposed to this, no matter whether they were themselves Vaishnavas or not. That's one. Secondly, there was a whole axis. So while there would be sort of scholars, who would be who would have linked up from the time of Chaitanyaism to, say, acknowledged centers, Mathura, Vrindavan, Puri, etc. There would be an intermediate range of men, and this is the interesting point, women, who would have had access to and would have mastered these expressive forms, whether of singing or of movement, and in fact it allowed for far greater mobility than did many other sects and faiths. And again, this has been discussed, that access to learning, for example, was one thing, access to the script, but also, I'm stressing side by side, performative things. Now, we find that many of the first generation actresses, if not of a later period, actually very often were immersed in or trained as Vaishnav singers. Shukumari is Shukumari Datta, that is Golak Shundari, is who later on was called Shukumari after a role that she played magnificently, was one of them. But there was another problem. So this is the plus side. And the flip side was these women who were, as I said, immersed and excellent at these performative practices were also seen, obviously, as on the margins and fringe, with their morality at this period coming into question. So, whereas earlier they would have been, well, maybe ridiculed, but also tolerated and even acclaimed, that ambivalent space disappears. So it's like either or now. So it's this binary which makes the public theatre, this almost at gunpoint, you have to be either this or that. That both feeds the talent of the public theatre, but also creates the greatest divide between who was to be seen as perfectly respectable and who was not. So the Kirtan, if we take that as one of the major regional markers of Bengali expressive form, I'm not saying it's the only, but one of the, and here I may add that Rabindranath Tagore also, Tagore, in a remark that he made in his letters from Java, Java Jatri Patro, which he wrote in, I think, 1920. I'm very bad with dates, 27, I think, or 26, either of those two. And he says that here, meaning he's talking about Bali, the island of Bali, dance is to them what Kirtan is to Bengal. That is, it flows in our blood. And needless to say, you can see the whole Vaishnav thing within Tagore as well. But to come back again to your question, what was the relationship? That amorphous and porous strata of both performers and performance practices, which prevailed in Bengal for many centuries, now had to be kind of identified, labeled, and loudly proclaimed. So, just as we've had Garv se kaho hum Hindu hai, there are uncanny echoes of this in the discourse of that period, which I've referred to in this particular article that I talked about, benediction and performance. But there was a shift, there's a difference. One was that it was largely a metropolitan, if not intelligentsia, but metropolitan Bhadralok class, which claimed this as a mantle for its self-definition not just against the British, but all other forms of, if I may say, faith, race, caste, etc. Now, so the problem was that what do you do with these women? Because on the one hand, you couldn't say we have to be proud of our heritage. On the other hand, your performances are being done by these women who you've already decided are, not bhadra enough. So one very intelligent stroke by which this was resolved was to say that playing the roles of these idealized saints, sant figures, Dhruva, and of course Chaitanya, and many such others, already, that is bhakts, that is, the bhakt is already canonized in the Vaishnava tradition. So to take the bhakt as the exemplar and to play that role on stage, no matter for a ticketed audience, no matter for an anonymous audience, but to do it to perfection, meant that the public theatre was enabling these women to actually expiate for their immorality, and all within quotes, and seek redemption, because this is also part of Vaishnava, one part of strand of Vaishnava tradition. It's called Rag Anuraga Bhakti. That is where you take on, where you in fact enact the role of the model and thereby assimilate the virtues of that. So it takes you, it's a kind of identification, process of identification, which makes you, and it is through expressiveness, it is through expression, it is through bhav. So this was one major way, and this too has its own sub-streams and tributaries. So this was one. So the second point was about commodification. So the first point is about how this ideological dilemma is quote unquote resolved. That is, you offer an argument that the public theatre has a right to exist and it is representative of the true culture of Bengal. Because, as you know, nowhere else were there women playing women at this time. Neither in Sangeet Natak nor in Parsi theatre, very occasionally, but not at all in the way that women had come to stay on the Bengali proscenium stage. So the constant attacks that people from within the theatre had to face from the larger populace, and the fact that the public theatres were still running, so the attacks were not obviously concurrent with shutting down the theatres. So this was like, you're allowed to live, but you constantly have to say, well. And one of the ways that, I'm not saying that therefore they brought in Neo Vaishnavism. Neo Vaishnavism was also, as a result of a large number of reasons, but it afforded a way out of this dilemma. So that was my first point. The second point, which I've not discussed in this article, but which subsequently I found very interesting material on, was the way Sankirtan, that is collective kirtan. And that again, within Vaishnavism, it was seen as a master stroke by which you mobilize people. So it's processional song, dance, and it's bringing in the collective as participatory. So it's not like one wise man standing up on the stage and holding forth to the shishyas, but it's the shishyas feeling empowered to come out and literally take over spaces. So if you look at early representations, visual representations, you find that it actually shows, and it's in the city, so it's Nago Shankit. Now what does this have to do with the public theatre and actresses? Plenty. It enables, that is to say, even before theatre takes this in as part of its spectacle that it offers. And it's actually advertised, both in Bangla and English. Come one, come all, fantastic Sankirtan on stage. Why? It's like period films saying, like whatever is happening now, Padmavati, which I have not seen, but the trailers and all are constantly saying, you want to see how it was? Armies marching, ghumar dance happening, blah blah blah. So it's this idea of invoking a kind of excitement, kind of visualization on a large canvas, because these are days before films, on a large canvas, sound and sight effects of something which is away from your mundane life, and at the same time, because there's this debate on what constitutes nirdosh amod, that is entertainment which is worthy entertainment. You say that it's religion actually. So even if you're getting a frisson, you're excited, you're seduced by sight and sound of women performing on stage, cross-dressed or whatever, you can always say, but this is actually for moral edification. And that's exactly the argument they put forth. They never say that it's kala, that it is art. They never say that it is hard work, which of course it is, it's labor. They always say it's something which is morally so superior and so edifying that it's bringing together, and this is exactly I'm quoting almost, that the English educated, deracinated, Bhadralok now will sit side by side and weep tears alongside the sort of more authentic, indigenous, untouched by colonialism Indian. So it's this great bringing together that Sankirtan on stage is doing. But my argument is that it was in fact already commodified as, what today would pass as ethnic Indian culture. So ethnic Bengali culture, ethnic Bengali Hindu culture. And just to give you an example, the Pathuriyagata Tagores, who are not as well known as the Jorashako Tagores, they actually had this retreat called Emerald Bower, which apparently now has become a campus, university campus. So Emerald Bower, as the name suggests, is emerald, so it's green, and bower, it's a retreat. And it was a place where they would entertain visitors. So General Ulysses Grant, I was surprised to know, had actually come to Calcutta in the US, and he was entertained there. And there was a list, they published in the newspapers a list of what they were going to offer. And guess what one of it was? A genuine Hari Sankirtan. So genuine Hari Sankirtan, Noch, boatman song, all become like items on a menu, like a 5-star buffet menu. So this is actually happening even before the public theatre takes this. So my point is that in understanding Binodini and her colleagues, we have to understand the nature of commodification that is happening. Not just because there are tickets being paid for, or that she is a wage-earning actress. Yeah.
Earlier, men used to play all roles on stage, be it a wife, mother, a child, or men themselves. But from 1870s, women started taking up roles on stage, thus making the crowd encounter something new.
Sure.
How was the reception of the same when women started appearing on stage, and where could one place Binodini in terms of her appearance as a woman on stage as well as her gender reversed roles?
Okay. It's understood as a given that once men or the larger audience had a real woman playing a real woman on stage. They didn't want to go back. So there were efforts made, especially once the Congress becomes an important force. There are efforts to again replace the women with boys. It's a total failure. So that's going fast forwarding. So it obviously was very attractive and almost became indispensable for the performance of theatre in Bengal, whereas, as I've been constantly reminding you, that elsewhere that was not the case. And you have a Bal Gandharv, you have a Jayashankar Sundari, and many others. So what happened by the time Binodini came was that yes, girls had been brought in primarily through the genre of Giti Natya. So a Giti Natya, as you can make out from the term itself, Git and Natya, was primarily also Geet Pradhan. That is to say, it was almost entirely dependent on songs. Now, here too is another link, that there were many communities of singers, not all necessarily courtesans and tawaifs, but many from that. But again, there would be a gradation. Like, where would you place the beggar woman who's a kirtaniya, who's singing for alms, in relation to a very a tawaif who's had training in classical music and who's also part of the metropolis. So there's that huge range. But clearly, when women started coming in, one of the most important selling points was that they should be able to sing. Dance, yes, but singing is more important. So, and because the Bengali stage, the public theatre at this time, I mean, that's a very grand term, but if you actually read the memoirs and look at the period, they're literally struggling people, you know. Sometimes they've had to run from one house to another to stage plays, and I'll show you a picture of one of the first houses in which they did their plays. They're at the mercy of whoever the city's administrators, moralists, whoever, as to that space where they're going to perform. And they certainly cannot hope to compete with any of the traditional characteristics that we associate with the proscenium stage. We assume that there's going to be thick, heavy brocade curtains, velvet curtains, there's going to be scenes, there's going to be, as they say in Bangla, scene sceneries. There's going to be, all that costs a huge amount of money. There's going to be machines that are going to work. Photoelectric lotuses are going to be announced when Binodini plays Damayanti in Nala Damayanti. That becomes a major selling thing. That is the so-called mechanical lotuses. So the theatre had to offer these railway train in motion, one of the advertisements says. So they have to offer these mechanical wonders, they have to offer the illusion of richness, of lights, of a whole orchestra, which they used to call the concert. Where are they going to get all this money from? Most of them didn't have these resources. So Giti Natya becomes very important because you can create a whole aura of spectacle with a lot of these women dancing and singing. So every third bit, you know, what people used to complain about in Hindi films, that why is the heroine changing costumes and dancing, actually has a long tradition. So partly they would justify it by saying that Sanskrit plays, the classical quote-unquote Indian plays also had songs. If you look at plays written for within the Vaishnav canon, they too have songs. Songs are very critical. If you look at the whole tradition of Jayadev and everything else, it is all musical. So there's a natural way in which music comes in, music, song, and therefore dance. But there's a particular way, because of the women, it comes in again as part of this mode of commodification. So it's happening at several levels. So once this is successful, people are not going to listen or come to see a play which has long dialogues and nothing of this, or extremely, what shall I say, so even a quote-unquote social play, say those written by Girish Ghosh later on, Samajik Natak, as they say, Samajik Natak. I'm thinking of one in particular which is called Balidan, which is about dowry basically, and the Balidan, the sacrificial goat, is the scapegoat is the daughter, and but it's very firmly the whole, if you like, the whole ethos of the play is dependent on songs, which is sung by this character called Jobi, who is singing to Krishna to speak of kind of the contemporary forms of oppression. So what we see as a kind of add-on, or what we see as extra, is actually intrinsic to these plays, both for reasons of, as I said, a larger tradition, for reasons of lack of funds and resources, as well as of the fact that you've been able to get these women who more or less come from entertaining communities of various kinds.
Ma'am, a section of Binodini's autobiography reflects on the repulsive or kind of despised people from Bengal, like especially when they went to perform in Delhi and then later they went to Lucknow. So especially when they were in Delhi, so they had a kind of aversion towards the Muslim community. And no mention of any Islamic literature had been there in her work. So I would
That's
want...
not quite true though. Anyway,
Okay. So, and also my question would be, what kind of Islamic literary or theatrical production was happening during this particular time when we are talking about the 19th century Bengal theatre?
See, this is a huge lacuna. This is a huge erasure. And so, if I were to put your question in another way, was the Bengali public theatre already within quotes Hindu project? Again, within quotes, I would say yes. Yes, with certain reservations. And I've dealt with this in the last epilogue to a book that's going to come out soon, which is a kind of, which would have come out maybe 15, 20 years ago, but it's substantially, some of which have, the chapters are from older articles I've published, but more than half the book is newly written. And I felt it was, I had addressed it in passing in the other book on Binodini. For example, about the reaction of spectators to a particular production of one of Bankim Chandra's novels, which had been turned into a play, or the enactment of Jauhar or Sati on stage. Okay, I had addressed it in passing, but I had not actually dealt with it in the way that I have tried to now. And I would answer, yes, it was largely a project which erased, at least visibly, this fact that Bengal, that Islam had many centuries of arrival and syncretism in Bengal. it's as if that has never happened. And this would, require another venue to explore that whole question as to why that happened. Secondly, and this is a mistake that, not a mistake, a sin of omission that I myself am guilty of, but I hope I have redressed it now, which is that Calcutta's population itself had a huge number of Muslims who were not just Bengalis. This is important. They were many, many kinds of Islam, if you like, and from different regions. So Kutchi, Afghani, Punjabi, Bihari, all in Bengal, in Calcutta. Many of them were also members of a kind of upper class, because within Islam in Bengal there was a huge divide of those who considered themselves to have been of foreign lineage and those who were seen as quote-unquote native converts. Again, this is something that's rarely talked about. So if you bring in all these factors, you don't also get a homogeneous sense of, just as I am sort of disagreeing with this idea of who is this Hindu, what is this Hindu, similarly of the Muslim. And you have to remember that Parsi theatre, which is very highly commodified and highly professional and much more successful in terms of its touring, pan-Indian, including Sri Lanka and present-day Sri Lanka and Myanmar. And I think once they even went to England. So all these Parsi theatre companies already had a mix of people, that is of writers, of song writers, of lyricists, of script writers, who were from all kinds of places and all faiths, because the kind of entertainment they provided had to be kind of appeal to a huge number of people, because they were much more mobile and professional. So Parsi theatre starts making its inroads into Calcutta very early. Again, this is not, you read a standard history of Bengali theatre, there's almost no mention of this fact. And I don't know why. I guess people feel they have to keep to their turfs. But the fact that Parsi theatre had no connection with Bengali theatre is completely unrealistic. It is not that. So my hunch would be, in terms of the audience, was the audience a heterogeneous, mixed audience, ethnically, race-wise, faith-wise, gender-wise? I would have to do much more work before I can give you a one-sentence answer. But my speculative answer would be that while there must have been some number of mixed people, and we do get some evidence of that, it's also possible that because the Bengali Muslim in Calcutta was usually the poor, the larger number of them. They perhaps may not have had even the money to buy this ticket. And the ones who did, we do hear of them here now and then.